In Chapter 1 of Signs and Wonders, Amy Jill Levine explores the story of Jesus healing a paralytic. That story is found in Mark chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. When he, Jesus, returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. So many gathered around that there was no longer room for them, not even in front of the door, and he was speaking the word to them. Then some people came, bringing to him a paralyzed man, carried by 4 of them. And when they could not bring him to Jesus because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him, and after having dug through it, they let down the mat on which the paralytic lay. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now some of the scribes were sitting there, questioning in their hearts, "Why does this fellow speak in this way? It is blasphemy. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" At once Jesus perceived in his spirit that they were discussing these questions among themselves, and he said to them, "Why do you raise such questions in your hearts? Which is easier, to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Stand up and take your mat and walk'? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic, "I say to you, stand up, take your mat, and go to your home." And he stood up and immediately took the mat and went out before all of them, so that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." This is God's story for God's people. Thanks be to God. No, don't worry. I have figured out exactly what to say to the insurance company to get them to cover your entire visit. This is something that my friend's doctor recently said to her. It is such a common problem for patients to arrive at their doctor's appointments and to not receive coverage afterwards from their health insurance company. This particular health insurance company has become such a problem that a bunch of doctors have stopped working with them altogether. By causing frustration and agitation to both doctors and patients, they are erecting barriers to care. When the people who were carrying the paralyzed man on his bed to Jesus, they saw barriers. One of the barriers was the large crowd, that there were so many people packed into this house. There was no way for a person who was in need of healing to get to Jesus. When those people carrying his bed decided to go in through the roof, there was still another barrier, the roof itself. The Gospel of Mark tells us that they dug up the roof and then lowered their friend down through it so that they might meet Jesus. The barriers that we face today with insurance companies and bureaucracy are much different than a large crowd and a thick mud roof. Though the barriers that we face today look very different, I think that this story teaches us something about how to face them. Though it is amazing that Jesus heals the paralyzed man, the story in the Gospel of Mark focuses on his friends, on his bed bearers. There were all sorts of people in the room who were listening to Jesus teach about the faith, teach about the way, listening to the word. And yet, out of everyone there, Jesus saw their faith. Faith is not necessarily an assent to a belief or idea, but it is an act. Faith is something we do. In this story, it is faithful to remove barriers between someone who needs care and the care. I see it as a faithful act that people like my friend's doctor is figuring out ways to navigate the ridiculous bureaucracy of the healthcare system, of health insurance companies, in order for my friend to receive the care she needs. Though it is complicated and difficult and probably a heavy weight that that doctor is carrying, it seems that she sees it as a gift and an opportunity to help other people rather than as just a heavy burden. In order for the caregivers to find a way through the barriers between them and Jesus, they had to understand that the paralyzed man was not a burden, but that their role as bed bearers was an opportunity to be faithful. So now I invite you to consider the stories of bed bearers and barriers in your own life. I invite you to share stories about the bed bearers in your life. Maybe you'll share a story that starts like this: "They carried me when..." Then I invite you to consider stories when you have been a bed bearer for someone else. Maybe your story will start something like this: "I made sure someone got care when..." And finally, I invite you to tell stories about the barriers that were between you or someone else and care. Maybe your story will start something like this. The barriers to care seemed insurmountable when... Friends, your stories are God's stories. Thanks be to God.